St. Pius X. Monsignor John Carroll Abbang. We were very loath to leave the old Venetian town of Castelfranco behind us. We should have liked to linger in the cool shade of the medieval walls, to wander through the old streets of the town, to inspect the cathedral with its famous altarpiece by Giorgione. But we had no time to spare for these pleasant occupations, so we turned our backs upon the town and set out along the road which leads to Riis. It was an uninteresting road, dusty and sun-baked, and it seemed interminably long. Our thoughts went back to those days, almost a century ago, when a little peasant boy tramped through rain and sleet in winter and the scorching rays of the sun in summer, to and from school, 14 kilometers every day, along this monotonous road. He was a sturdy little fellow with curly hair and a bright, intelligent face. He did not seem to mind the roughness of the way, for he had taken off his shoes and had slung them over his shoulder. Of course, there was an added reason for that. He knew that his parents could not really afford to buy shoes for him, so he made them last as long as possible. It was a pleasant sight to see him as he walked along merrily in his bare feet, not minding the dust or the frost, and holding in his hand a little satchel which contained his dinner, a piece of black bread. How easy it was to see in him the warm, generous heart, humble and self-sacrificing, which within a few years was to cast its glory over the whole church. So we trod in the footsteps of little baby Sarto until, turning a corner, we saw in front of us the little cluster of houses which is Riis, and above them the tall bell tower of the village church. And here on our right was the humble cottage which we had come so far to see. Our pilgrimage was at an end. We were crossing the doorstep of the house where Pius X was born. Early years. It was on the 2nd of June in the year 1835 that a second son was born to Giovanni Battista Sarto, the village postman, and his wife, Margherita Sanson. On the following day, according to the good custom of those parts, he was taken to the church to be baptized, receiving the names Giuseppe Melchiorre. Little did the old parish priest think that the baptismal book in which he made a note of the event would one day be bound in gold and guarded jealously as one of the greatest treasures of Riis. Of little baby's childhood we need say little. Under the wise care of his mother he was brought up to love God and his Holy Mother. It was his great delight to serve Mass, and very often, when the church bell rang while he was in the fields, he would hasten to borrow the shoes of one of his companions, so that he might run and serve at the altar. It is no wonder, then, that before many years had passed he conceived a great desire to be a priest and to offer the holy sacrifice himself. Up to this he had been frequenting the elementary classes at Riis, receiving special instruction in Latin from the curate, who noted with satisfaction his quick intellect and remarkable memory. In 1846 he was old enough to attend the grammar school at Castelfranco. He made great progress there, so that at the examinations held in 1850 he was first in every subject. The next thing to be done was to send him to a seminary, for he had now told the parish priest of his desire, and the good old man, full of joy and enthusiasm, had persuaded John Battista to submit to the divine will and to give his son to God. But where was the necessary money to come from? Neither John Battista nor the parish priest had any to spare. But little baby was not dismayed. He trusted in divine providence, and it was quick to come to his aid. Cardinal Monico, the Patriarch of Venice at that time, had the privilege of nominating students for several free places in the seminary of Padua. When he was told of the plight of little baby Sarto, the cardinal, who had himself been a poor boy of Riis, at once agreed to send him to the great seminary to continue his studies for the priesthood. So Bapi received the cassock, and was for 8 years a student of Padua, doing all things well for the glory of God, striving all the time after that goal which was to be the ideal of his whole life, to be a holy priest. Curate and parish priest. Once again Giuseppe Sarto passed along the road from Riese to Castelfranco, but today he did not notice the dust. He did not see the familiar landmarks which had relieved the monotony of the long road in his childhood. One thought filled his mind to the exclusion of everything else: today I shall be a priest of the Most High. And he strained his eyes to catch a first glimpse of the old city where he was to be ordained. For his mother that was the happiest day of her life. Many years afterwards, she was to see him clad in all the splendor of the cardinalate, but her heart did not beat with the same intense joy as on that morning when he became one of the anointed of God, a priest. A few days after his ordination he was appointed as curate to Don Antonio Costantini, the archpriest of Tombolo, a village of about 1,500 inhabitants. Don Antonio conceived an immediate liking for the young curate, and being a zealous man, determined that he should be as well prepared as possible to labor for souls. To this end he tried to form him in the ways of parish life, paying special attention to the criticism of his sermons, and showing him how he might improve his delivery and manner of address. But in private Don Antonio wrote delightedly to a friend, "They have sent me a young priest as curate with orders to form him to the duties of a parish priest, but I assure you that it is likely to be the other way about. He is so zealous, so full of good sense and other precious gifts that I could learn much from him. One day or another he will wear the mitre, of that I am certain, and afterwards, who knows?" Gradually Don Giuseppe acquired quite a reputation for his preaching, and the neighboring towns strove to secure him for their special sermons. This success, however, had no effect on the young priest except to make him humble himself and give all the glory to God. He saw in himself only a poor and unworthy disciple whom the Master was pleased to use as a humble instrument for the salvation of souls. The young curate of such a parish did not receive much for his upkeep, but even out of his slender allowance he gave the greater part to the poor. He found it impossible to refuse them anything, so that time and time again he had to pawn his watch. As for the fees which he received for his sermons, he never returned to Tombolo with them in his pocket. They had gone to the relief of some poor soul on the way. When Don Antonio remonstrated with him and pointed out that he should save some for his mother, he would reply, "These poor people were in greater need than she. Our Lord will provide for her also, so great was his faith in divine providence." Don Antonio at this time had very bad health, and was often so weak that he could not even rise to say Mass. Accordingly, all the work of the parish fell upon the curate. But no one would have imagined that it was hard work for him, so cheerfully did he fulfill all his duties. He was at the beck and call of everyone, especially of the sick and needy, for affliction of every kind made a deep impression on his tender heart. Well might the people of Tombolo apply to him the words used with reference to his divine Master Pertransiat Benefaciendo. He went about doing good. In May 1867, Don Giuseppe was appointed parish priest of Salzano, an important parish of over 4,500 inhabitants. The heart of Don Antonio was full of sorrow at the departure of his young curate, and the peasants of Tombolo were inconsolable. The people of Salzano, on the other hand, were surprised that a curate from such a place should have been chosen as their parish priest, for they expected that as usual some dignity of the diocese would receive the appointment. But when they had heard his first sermon their admiration knew no bounds. What was the bishop thinking of to leave a man like this buried for so long among the yokels of Tombolo, they said. It was not long before his new parishioners discovered that the virtues of their parish priest were not confined to his sermons. His warm heart opened out and gathered in his new children, and they, in their turn, seeing his Christ-like charity and care for their souls and bodies, responded accordingly. Although he was now receiving more money than he had done before, it was not sufficient for his inexhaustible almsgiving, so that on many occasions he found himself with no food in the larder and no money to buy any. No wonder that his sister, Rosa, who kept house for him, was almost at her wit's end. His people often saw him early in the morning, opening the church doors and performing many of the humblest offices of the sacristan. "When I am old and infirm, it will be the sacristan who will have to get up early," he would say, laughingly. In the year 1873, however, when cholera broke out, his self-consuming charity shone forth in all its splendor. He nursed and tended his beloved people, prepared the sick for death, administered the sacraments, and comforted the living. "If it had not been for Don Giuseppe, I would have died of fear and sorrow," said one old man years later. Not even at night did he get any rest, for he had to attend the funerals of the victims of the plague, who could not be buried during the daytime on account of the infection. Sometimes it happened that he had to help to carry the coffin and to dig the graves himself. It is quite certain that his strength could not have lasted much longer under so great a strain. Fortunately, the bishop had already been informed of his too great exertions, so that at the earliest opportunity he was moved from Salzano. Canon of Treviso. Once more a flock was deprived of the loving care of its pastor, but this time the people were consoled by the great honor which Don Giuseppe received. He was appointed canon of the Cathedral of Treviso, spiritual director of the seminary, and chancellor of the diocese. As soon as he learned of the bishop's decision to promote him to the canonry, he begged, with his customary humility, to be allowed to remain a simple parish priest. But the bishop could not be persuaded to let him stay at Salzano, where he had been overworking and starving himself for his people. So Don Giuseppe went to Treviso and undertook his new labors cheerfully and with the self-sacrificing zeal which was characteristic of him. Perhaps the new work was not so congenial to him after the more active life at Tombolo and Salzano, but, if such was the case, he showed no sign of it. He did everything for the glory of God and not for his own satisfaction, so that he undertook every kind of work with the same cheerful readiness. He threw himself with special ardor into his work as spiritual director, for it was a task most dear to his heart, to form priests who would be worthy ministers of Christ and of his church. As a professor who was there at the time tells us, he never wandered into vain speculations, but was always most practical, striving to form priests who would be able to face the world and its difficulties, to evangelize, correct, instruct, and counsel the faithful. His opening discourse to the students was remarkable for its humility. "You expect to find in me a man of great experience, of profound ascetical and theological knowledge, but I have none, or practically none of these qualities. I am only a poor country parish priest, who has come here by the will of God. But just because I am here by the will of God, you must resign yourselves to listening to the words even of a poor parish priest, and bear with me." From the famous encyclical which, as Pope, he addressed to the priests of the world, we can gather some of the thoughts which he must have impressed on the minds of the students at Treviso. A priest cannot stand alone. For good or for evil, his life and behavior necessarily affect his people, and when that life is truly good, how great a blessing it is to them. Since you are merely God's instruments in the salvation of souls, these instruments must be such as he can handle. And why? Do you think that God uses us to further his glory because of any inborn excellence or of any qualities acquired by our own personal effort? Not so, for it is written, "The foolish things of the world hath God chosen that he may confound the wise, and the weak things of the world hath God chosen that he may confound the strong, and the base things of the world, and the things that are contemptible, hath God chosen, and things that are not, that he might bring to naught things that are. There is one thing, however, which unites man to God, one thing which makes him pleasing, and is not unworthy coadjutor, in the dispensation of his mercy, and this one thing is sanctity of life. If this holiness, which is the surpassing knowledge of Jesus Christ, be wanting to the priest, he lacks everything. Very soon an even greater burden was laid upon the shoulders of Monsignor Sarto. In 1879 the bishop died, and he was elected vicar capitular, so that to him fell the administration of the diocese while it remained vacant. He filled this office until June of the following year, when Monsignor Caligari, the new bishop, took possession of the diocese. 2 years later, in 1882, Monsignor Caligari was succeeded by Monsignor Apollonio. Both of these bishops appreciated to the full the sterling qualities of their chancellor. They noticed with admiration the prudent and competent way in which he solved the most intricate problems of the diocese. They found in him not only an efficient administrator, but also a trusted companion and counselor. Slowly but surely the reputation of Monsignor Sarto began to spread, even beyond the limits of the diocese, and men looked upon him as one who would before long be called to the episcopate. One day a friend said to Monsignor Sarto, "There is one thing which I cannot understand." "What is that?" "Why they do not realize at Rome that you have all the qualities necessary for a bishop. Do you think that that is the kind of thing you should wish for a friend? And why not? Doesn't St. Paul say, 'Leave St. Paul alone'? The cross is a joyous burden so long as a priest wears it under his cassock, but as soon as he has to wear it outside, even though you attach it to a chain of gold, it becomes a real burden. Let us talk about something else. Bishop of Mantua. It was towards the end of the summer of 1884 that Monsignor Apollonio summoned Monsignor Sarto one day to his private oratory. "Let us kneel here before the blessed sacrament and pray about a matter which concerns us both." The poor chancellor did not know what to think, and feared that something had happened at Reims, but when he had risen to his feet again, the bishop said with emotion, "I am happy and yet at the same time sorry to tell you that the Holy Father has appointed you Bishop of Mantua." The humble soul of Monsignor Sarto was filled with dismay. Convinced as he was of his own unworthiness, he felt that it was his duty to write to Pope Leo XIII and beg him to appoint some more suitable person. But his reputation had gone before him to the Vatican, and his efforts were of no avail. So, confessing his own weakness, and trusting in the divine strength to help him, he resigned himself to the will of God and set out for Rome. After he had received episcopal consecration in the Eternal City, he returned to Treviso, where he remained for some time. Before taking possession of his diocese, he addressed a letter to the mayor of Mantua. It ended with these striking words, "Your new bishop, poor in all things but rich in love, has no other desire than to procure the salvation of souls and to form among you one family of friends and brothers. For the advantage of souls I shall spare myself neither care, nor vigils, nor fatigues, and shall have nothing more at heart than your salvation." Perhaps someone will ask on what I am relying for the fulfillment of my promises. I reply, on hope, the hope of Christ. I can do all things in him who strengtheneth me. Such was the message of the bishop to his flock. The new bishop found Mantua in a lamentable condition. Innumerable political wrangles had uprooted all charity and brotherly love from among the citizens, and class was set against class. The people no longer observed the feast days, and were quite ignorant of Christian doctrine. Many of the priests were imbued with the ideas of the New Italy, and had lost the ecclesiastical